This presentation looks at the idea of economic growth and sustainable economic growth. The two phrases are not really the same, and we have to identify what makes one different from the other. We know that for economic growth to be sustainable, we mean a certain thing. So we have to ask ourselves, what is it that is different between economic growth and sustainable economic growth? Well, we know that economic growth is a rise in national income, but sustainable economic growth implies a method, a certain approach to economic growth. So we know that when we want to increase our GDP or national income, we use scarce resources. We use resources such as land, labor, capital, and enterprise. And economic growth also creates negative externalities such as pollution. So these are two facts about economic growth that we can't really get away from. We use scarce resources and we create negative externalities. So this gives us a clue as to what we mean by sustainable economic growth. We have to take into account that in producing an increase in GDP, we are using resources for a start. So let's identify what these resources are. We know that we label them as land, labor, capital, and enterprise, but some of those resources are what we call non-renewable. Oil, for example, is a non-renewable resource because there is only a certain amount of it in the world, and we can't make any more of it. So that will run out, and once it's gone, it's gone. Whereas other things, such as wood and sources of food like fish, are what we call renewable. And this means that they can regenerate themselves, we can grow more trees, and we can allow fish to breed. So we have two types of resources in the world, non-renewable and renewable. And we have to make the distinction between these two types of resources. Both of these definitions are helpful in defining sustainable economic growth. So to understand what is sustainable economic growth, we can look at what makes economic growth unsustainable. And one thing that makes economic growth unsustainable is when we use up non-renewable resources without finding new resources to take their place. So, for example, oil is being used up. Oil is our major source of energy, the thing that we depend on for energy in the world most, and it is being used up. And we have to therefore find new sources of energy to replace oil when it runs out. If we don't, our economic growth that we are enjoying at the moment will be unsustainable. So that is one definition of unsustainable economic growth, one way in which economic growth can be unsustainable. So by this definition, we can also see what is sustainable economic growth, which is that we don't use up non-renewable resources without finding new ones, new sources, new resources. So let's look at another way in which economic growth can be unsustainable and get another idea of what constitutes sustainable economic growth. Well, economic growth can be unsustainable if we use up renewable resources too fast. And two examples of this can be the falling fish stocks in the world. The amount of fish in the sea is decreasing because we are fishing too fast. We're taking too many fish out of the water and not allowing them to breed before we take them out of the water. And also, cutting down trees too fast can lead to deforestation, and this is another example of unsustainable economic growth because we are cutting down the trees far too fast, and this is not allowing us to replace them. So this is another example of unsustainable economic growth that we can have, using up renewable resources, but using them up too quickly. So now we have two examples of unsustainable economic growth, and we can look at a third example of unsustainable economic growth, which is where we allow population to grow too fast. Increase in population puts a huge strain on the world's resources, and this means that we cannot maintain our speed of economic growth or our rate of economic growth, and this is another way in which economic growth can be seen as unsustainable. So by understanding what we mean by unsustainable, we have a good idea of what we mean by sustainable economic growth, which is economic growth that finds substitutes for non-renewable resources that are being used up, economic growth that doesn't mean that renewable resources are used too quickly, but used at the right speed so they can renew themselves, and economic growth that controls the growth rate of population at the same time. If we achieve these three things, we will have sustainable economic growth in the world.